This is SFL On Air, a podcast for millennials. On episode 1, Emily Ekins and Matthew LaCorte discuss millennials, politics, and the modern world. Hello all, I'm Zoë Little, and I welcome you to the first ever live broadcast of SFL On Air. Since this is your first time tuning in, I'm pretty sure, I wanted to take a moment to introduce myself and Students for Liberty and the podcast. I am a senior campus coordinator with Students for Liberty, and I'm from North Carolina. I go to App State University, and I'll be moderating the fabulous discussions that we are sure to have on every SFL On Air episode. Students for Liberty, SFL, is an international 501c3 nonprofit, student-led, student-run organization that promotes civil and economic liberty by distributing resources to student groups and identifying and training student leaders. We are all about students at Students for Liberty. SFL On Air is a brand new project from SFL. Each episode will bring in a guest speaker who is an expert on a certain topic that's relevant to young folks, and a young activist who is passionate and knowledgeable on that topic. Now, the best part about SFL On Air is that you can browse lolcats or whatever you want while you listen, since it's just audio. And if you miss anything, a recording will be archived on iTunes and Amazon as a podcast. There are some benefits, of course, to attending the live broadcast, because after our guests and I chat for a while, we'll turn it over to you, the audience, for questions. If you're listening live, you can type in any questions you want me to ask to our guests in the questions box on the side of your screen, and I will ask them at the end of the show. Just be sure to mention what your name is and what school you attend if you're a student, or where you're listening from if you're not a student. Our guests tonight are Emily Ekins and Matthew LaCorte. Emily Ekins is the director of polling for the Reason Foundation, where she leads the Reason Root Public Opinion Research Project, launched in 2011. She's an active member of the American Association for Public Opinion Research and the American Political Science Association. Emily is working on her PhD thesis in political science at the University of California, Los Angeles. Her professional experience includes quantitative analyses of the Tea Party movement for the Cato Institute and conducting survey analyses and case writing for Dr. Peter Tufano at the Harvard Business School. She's discussed her research on Fox News, Fox Business, CNBC, The Blaze, and her research has appeared in the Washington Post, Politico, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Times. Matthew LaCorte, our student activist, is an undergraduate student at Hofstra University in New York, where he's majoring in political science with a minor in economics. Matthew is currently the co-chair of the North American Executive Board of Students for Liberty and a member of the International Executive Board. He's a former intern of the Cato Institute and the Competitive Enterprise Institute and a Young Voices advocate. He's been published in the Daily Caller, Real Clear Policy, Town Hall, the Los Angeles Register, the Boston Herald, Forbes, Al Jazeera America, and has been a guest on the Stossel Show on Fox Business Network. Matthew, I wanted to give you a chance to tell us a little bit about your work as a student activist in your own words. What are some of your past achievements that you're most proud of, and what great things can we expect from you in the future?
Well, first, let me say thanks, Zoe, for having me on. This is really going to be an exciting discussion and a topic that I'm very passionate about. My work as a student activist kind of starts before my involvement with Students for Liberty. My senior year of high school, some listeners may know, there's a rapper out there by the name of Lupe Fiasco. And his record company, his record label, refused to put out his album. And so, as a big Lupe Fiasco fan, I got together with a few of my other fellow students, and we organized a protest in New York City for over 300 people outside of his record company, and we forced the record company to release the album. According to my own research, it's the first time that a fan base has ever got together to force a record company to release the musical record. So this was kind of the first thing I did as a student activist back in high school. And I got really excited and energized by the fact that I could get people together on the internet and that we could do something and have real world impact, and people could listen to a musical record that a lot of people enjoy. So once I graduated high school, I knew that I wanted to turn my sights not into music, but into the ideas of liberty, to libertarianism. So I got on campus at Hofstra University in Long Island, New York, and I started on the first day the Hofstra Students for Liberty, or the pro-liberty organization on campus. Within 1 year, we took our club from being one member, me, to the largest political club on campus. It was super exciting. I had a great time, and it was important for me to get out there and do what I wanted to do and spread the ideas of liberty to my fellow classmates. My sophomore year, I applied and was accepted to SFL's Campus Coordinator Program. This was my first year of involvement with SFL. And surprisingly enough, in SFL's 6th year of operation, I was the first ever campus coordinator or just local representative in all of New York State. That was just amazing to me. So I spent the year reaching out to groups all over the state, and I just had a wonderful time doing it. My junior year of college, I was accepted onto the North American Executive Board for Students for Liberty, and I was the Northeast Regional Director, so I oversaw all of our campus coordinators from New York State up through Maine. This year, I'm very excited. I'm honored to be the co-chairman of the North American Executive Board with my fellow co-chair, Noel Mandel from Texas. And together, we've just had a wonderful time with an incredible 16-member student board that just does incredible work both in the United States and in Canada. So some upcoming activism that I've really been working on that excites me is that SFL is running 21 regional conferences this year, this fall, I should say, in both Canada and the United States. And so our upcoming New York Regional Conference, I've gone to it 4 years in a row. I'm so excited. It's coming up on November 15th, and that's something that I'm really gearing up for and something that should be really cool. And on a local level, at Hofstra University in October, we are actually hosting an immigration debate. Immigration has been a really big, hot topic lately in American politics. And so the Hofstra Students for Liberty are going to be hosting an immigration debate. We're going to try to get as many students as possible to come out and talk about this real critical issue. So that's what I'm doing on a micro level and a macro level. I'm really happy to be here and excited to talk more about millennials and the future of politics.
Fabulous, Matt. Thank you. And Emily, I'm sure there are a handful of people in the audience who are hearing about your work Polling for Reason for the first time. Could you tell us a little bit about the history of the Reason Root poll, the polling process, and how you became involved with it all? And do you have any recent or upcoming work that we should look out for?
Sure. There were quite a few questions there, so let me try and do one at a time, and maybe you'll have to remind me about some of the later ones. But let me tell you about the Reason Root poll. This is a new project that Reason Magazine, many of the listeners may be more familiar with Reason.com, which is the website of Reason Magazine, and Reason Foundation. We've begun conducting national public opinion polls. This is very similar to the Gallup poll or the Pew Research Center poll, where we are asking people about their attitudes about government, their views on various salient public policies, and also their values and other, cultural trends. And we started this in 2011, and every couple of months we have a brand new poll out. And most recently, we decided to conduct a poll just of millennials. And typically, what is a millennial? Millennials are often viewed as those who are born after 1980. They're the largest generation in American history, larger than the baby boomers, and much more diverse, a lot more new Americans. And millennials were those who were responsible for re-electing President Obama in 2012. If it hadn't been for the millennial cohort, Mitt Romney actually got more votes from Americans, from older Americans. And so we decided to conduct a poll to learn more about this particular cohort. So I'll be sharing more of that information with you this evening about what we found. But that gives you a little overview of the project. To give you a little background on polling, we actually use the same polling firms that the Pew Research Center uses to conduct our telephone polls. And when we use web-enabled surveys, like we did for our millennial survey, we use the same pollster that The Economist uses and the CBS New York Times poll use. And the reason this is very important is so that we are using high-quality methodology, just what everyone else is using, to really show that we are dedicated to the truth and understanding what people really think. A lot of pollsters out there kind of have an agenda, and they want to manufacture results that are friendly to their cause. That's actually not what we're about. We're basically doing market research. We want to understand our audience so we understand how to speak to them.
Fabulous. Is there any polls coming out in the near future that you could give us a little hint about, and anything that we should look out for from you?
Well, just next month there will be another national poll. And I can't say exactly what the topics will be, but we'll be looking at things that are salient in the news at that time. And we're also planning to do another poll of young people early next year.
Fabulous. So, without further ado, I guess we'll get into our discussion. Matthew, Emily, I have been told that this is not your first time crossing paths with one another. How do you guys know each other?
Well, earlier this year, I guess it was in March, Emily and I both spoke at a panel for the Institute for Humane Studies and Mercatus Center on millennials and the impact that millennials will have on politics moving forward. And that was really an interesting time when Emily and I were able to talk to each other because she was working on this poll and all this that came out with Reason Root poll recently. And so we were throwing all these ideas back and forth about millennials and all these things that are happening, and we were talking about Students for Liberty. And it was a super exciting weekend. I think that we will replicate what we talked about then here for you guys tonight.
Awesome. So this poll, Emily, you refer to millennials as the politically unclaimed generation. What do you mean by this label?
Well, a lot of people out there have kind of decided that young people today are big government Democrats because they showed up with such high turnout rates for President Barack Obama, who is a Democrat. And they assume that that must mean that young people like anything and everything that President Obama believes, which is, as you can imagine, just not quite accurate. Young people do like the president. They have a favorable opinion of him, but that doesn't mean they agree with everything he thinks, and that doesn't mean they condone all of his actions. Now, the reason we call it the politically unclaimed generation is that in our work, we show that young people are increasingly distrustful of both political parties. They actually are 3 times more likely than older Americans to say they are politically independent, and that even when you probe them and you say, you know, maybe do you lean one way or to the other? Do you think you lean a little bit more to the Democrats or lean a bit more to the Republicans? Fully a third of them say no. Now, they do view Democrats as the better of 2 bad options right now, but they still don't see Democrats as a very good option. And what this means, and we can go into further detail about what the data says, but what this suggests is that the Democrats just can't count on young people as being in their pockets. And the Republican Party, if they ever want to make inroads with this generation, there are a few things they're going to have to reconsider. And so both parties are going to have to compete for the young millennial generation.
That's just so interesting. There are so many topics covered in this survey of millennials, and I was wondering if you guys both could share with us some of the results that you found most interesting or surprising. Matt, are you familiar with the poll, or is there anything really interesting that you found in this survey?
Sure. So something that I am fascinated by, as I've looked more into polling lately as well, is the wording and how important just, little words can be when we're talking about results. So I'll let Emily talk about this further because obviously she has some expertise here. But a lot of the polls that were coming out asking Americans and millennials if they support a larger government with more services or a smaller government with few services, and then seeing what the results are, and then saying, oh, look, people want a larger government. But what Emily did, which I think was brilliant, was added in this very important caveat. Would you want a larger government with more services and higher taxes, or would you want a smaller government with fewer services and less taxes? And the results flipped on this. So I'll let Emily explain further, but I think that this little interesting point, that asking people how they view government is not the only way to really probe how they view government and society and the way the government should operate in different sectors. It's also asking the costs. So not only the benefits, but also the costs. So, Emily, what are the specific numbers for that? Because I think that was definitely the most interesting finding in the poll.
Sure. Well, so why don't I give a little context, too? A couple of years ago, the Pew Research Center in Washington, D.C., had a striking finding. They had this big report out on millennials. It was right after the election in 2000, actually, I think it was 2009 or 2010. So everyone's still thinking, wow, millennials really like President Obama. You know, what are their political beliefs? And Pew found this striking finding. Whereas all older Americans tend to prefer a smaller government with fewer services, young people, the millennials, were the only cohort in which a majority said they wanted a larger government with more services. Back in 2009, it might have been as high as 67% who said they wanted a larger government and more services. And this just shocked people. They said, oh my goodness, you know, older people are small government conservatives. Young people are big government liberals. This is a sea change. This will change American politics forever. I mean, those make great headlines. But that was a bit of an exaggeration. Now, since that poll has been conducted, more and by others have found that number has receded a bit. Now it's about 54%. But that's still a majority. 54% is still a majority that say they want larger government and more services. And we find the same thing in our poll. However, recent evidence has suggested that a lot of young people out there don't really know what we mean when we say large government. And actually, as you take a step back and we don't think about the rhetoric of today, I mean, what does a large government mean? Now, many people who are a little bit older might say, well, large government means high taxes. Large government means lots of heavy regulations. Large government means perhaps a militarized police force. Large government means the government has more control over your life. But a lot of young people today didn't grow up during the Cold War. And they didn't hear about big government and socialism and capitalism in the way that they used to. Now, that's all a lead up to why we asked a second question. The second question was, okay, so assuming, let's suppose for a moment millennials don't know what big government is. If that's true, then we should mention taxes. So in a second question, we say, would you prefer a larger government with more services and high taxes, or a smaller government with fewer services and low taxes? And support flips. Now, 57% of millennials prefer a smaller government with fewer services and low taxes. Taxes somehow really changes the calculus. And if I may, I want to add one thing. In addition to that, and now other researchers have found this too, that if you don't mention taxes, there's a really big difference in opinion between Caucasian millennials and African American, Latino, and Asian millennials when it comes to the size of government. White millennials are about 20 points more likely to say they want small government. However, once we mention taxes, that gap disappeared among Caucasian, Hispanic, and Asian millennials, and it narrowed for all of them, but it completely disappeared for some. And what this tells us is that some groups are a little bit more likely to associate the words big government with high taxes. And this tells us that the language that we use matters a lot. We can't rely on old language from, post-World War II, Cold War language about big government. We need to be specific. We're talking about what government can and cannot do, what government can tell you or tell you not to do.
I'm really glad you brought up the point about examining your results by race. I thought that was, if I had to pick a most interesting part of the poll, that section was definitely the most interesting to me. And you brought up another good point about language. And there's actually been a little bit of controversy that surrounded the poll, Emily. I saw a handful of articles responding to this front page New York Times Magazine cover story. Has the libertarian moment finally arrived? In which you were quoted and your poll was referenced. And these articles were critical not only of the Times article itself, but of your data. So I'm going to share a few quotes from articles that I found. A quote from Why the Libertarian Moment Isn't Really Happening, which is a very creative title, and I have to hand it to The Atlantic on that one.
This is David Frum.
Yes. Every serious study of the political attitudes of voters under 30 has discovered them to be the most pro-government age group since the cohort that directly experienced the Great Depression. And then New York Magazine published an article, How Libertarians Snookered the New York Times Magazine, that challenged the validity of advocacy polling as a measure of public opinion at all. The author states that the type of polling that you did uses what is often, and I quote, very neutral sounding language, which invariably produces results that present public opinion in a favorable light for their sponsor. And you've already addressed this to an extent. And then another response from the Pew Research Center, they published that there are still many Americans who do not have a clear sense of what libertarian means. And their surveys find that on many issues, the views among people who call themselves libertarian, like you sometimes measured in your survey, don't differ much from those of the overall public. How would you defend your results in light of these criticisms?
Well, again, there's actually quite a few questions there. So let me take one of the first ones, and then remind me if I don't get to some of the latter ones. So the first one, gosh, you have to remind me what the first one was. I'm sorry.
Advocacy polling. The way that you measure the opinions of Americans by using different language.
Well, as it so happens, so that article was written by Jonathan Chait. And he and I and the author of the New York Times article got into a bit of a Twitter debate, actually, on this issue. And as it so happens, the very questions that were brought up and that Chait said were crafted happened to be questions that the Pew Research Center had written themselves. And I used them on purpose because I wanted to ask them again. In a more recent survey, I wanted to see if answers had changed or if they'd stayed the same, and it was a way to measure, attitudes using a question that has already been tried and accepted by others. So, I mean, if he's saying it's crafted language, then he's indicting the very company, the very organizations that he claims is the gold standard. So that was kind of funny, and I think part of it was that a lot of times the critics. They don't actually read the thing that they are criticizing. And if he had, he would have seen every single time that I cited, this question came from the World Values Survey, or this question came from the Pew Research Center, all highly reputable polls. I think what happens is a lot of people are very upset at the idea that there could be an impulse, a libertarian impulse that's trending in America. I mean, no one is saying that all young people today are proto-libertarians, but what we are seeing is we're seeing a generation more open and interested in liberty than we've ever seen. And that is unique, and it should be identified, but some people aren't happy about that. And so they're a little bit too quick to dismiss data that doesn't comport with their prior assumptions.
It certainly seemed by the tone of the articles criticizing things that it was a little reactionary. So the Pew Research Center poll that asked people what libertarian meant and sort of examined the views of average Americans compared to what they identified as politically. I don't think that's necessarily a relevant criticism because the language is so different for everyone, and different words mean different things. And in your poll, it seemed like there were so many contradictory positions, like liberals more likely to vote for a socially liberal, fiscally conservative candidate than any other cohort, and a slight majority of conservative identified millennials supporting raising taxes on the wealthy to reduce national debt, and supporting business regulations to protect the public, while acknowledging at the same time that these regulations are often written to protect special interests. So it doesn't seem like that criticism is valid if you look at every other political label and you see this interesting spread of contradictory beliefs. So my first thought as a result, looking at that, is, are millennials confused?
Well, okay, so I want to address the first thing about coherence. Now, this is something that's well understood in the public opinion, academic literature, is that most people hold contradictory views. And this is normal. For some reason, a lot of people out there have this desire to impose on libertarians this overly rigid litmus test. Now, if we did the same to conservatives, or we did the same thing to liberals, we would find hardly any of them. I mean, think about Elizabeth Warren, and I think it's, is it Mark Pryor running for Senate out of Arkansas? I mean, so we've got a Democrat in Arkansas, we've got one of the most liberal senators from Massachusetts in the same political party. They both identify as liberal, and yet they are so different on many different issues, and yet they aren't held to the same standard. I think that a lot of times with these polls, it depends on the questions you're asking about. And when it comes to millennials specifically, I actually think they're a lot like everybody else. All people often will hold contradictory and incoherent views to some degree. But I think people misunderstand what some of the data says. So, for instance, an example would be regulation. We found that 63% of millennials said that they believed that regulators, when they write and enforce regulations, often favor special interests over the public. That's 63% that thought regulators favor special interests over the public. And yet, a plurality of them say that regulation of business is necessary. And some people say, well, isn't this a contradiction? I think is a resounding no. Most people believe that there is some level of government regulation that could be useful in the absence of other solutions or technology that could help people solve the problems on their own. However, that doesn't mean that all of the regulation that's out there is necessary. Much of it is excessive, and it is used to protect the politically connected at the expense of everyone else. Now, when I look at that data, millennials get that. They get that some regulation to some degree could be useful, but they are very open to the idea that regulators cannot be trusted to do the right thing. I think that's not incoherence. I think that that is just an accurate view of reality.
I think that's an excellent point.
I'll jump in here
Oh,
real
sure.
quick on this question of confusion. And I think we also need to remember that young people are young, and we are figuring out what we believe. In talking about Students for Liberty, you're dealing with some students who could be 18 years old, just going to college. It's their first weekend next week. They just got to school. Young people are figuring out what they believe, and in politics, that is instrumental. And so I don't think that young people are confused. I think Emily knocked it out of the park. That most people don't assume that politics is the most important thing in the world, and that if they don't nail down their political philosophy, so there is no contradictions at all, and it's completely coherent, that they don't know what else to do with their lives, that just doesn't happen. We're talking about a very small view of political science PhDs out there. Most people hold views about politics, and they watch CNN every now and then, and they want to talk to their friends when a big issue comes up. But having contradictory views or young people being confused about a few issues, I don't think is a wrong thing, and I don't think that it should put any polls or any of these new waves of libertarianism into confusion. I think more to respond to some of these other criticisms, I'll run through some findings from the poll. 66% saying that government is usually inefficient, which is up from 42% in 2009. Pretty huge jump. Millennials clearly favoring individual freedom when it comes to things like marijuana, gambling, nanny state laws like New York City sugar drink bans, things like that. 58% saying that government agencies abuse power. There's probably a lot coming from the revelations about the NSA. And then there was a great Harvard Institute of Politics poll in 2013 where 33%, one-third of millennials said that political involvement rarely had any tangible results, up 5% since the year before. And you take all of these, and then you add it to the fact that organizations like Students for Liberty and like Young Americans for Liberty are literally doubling in size per year. And you have to say, okay, there are a tremendous amount of young people out there who are supportive of the president, supportive of big government, whatever that means. There are a lot of people out there, young people, who don't really care about politics. And there are a lot of people out there, young people, who lean libertarian and believe that individual freedom, that social tolerance, and that being fiscally centrist or conservative is the way to go. And so you can't say with a blank slate that this generation is really anything right now, right? But you cannot say that we don't have libertarian leanings, and that you can't say that looking long term, that's really going to shake up the political establishment.
I wanted to add something about trends. Matthew's exactly right. We actually found some small trends even within our data set, which is of just one cohort. And so, for example, some of the things we found is that when, as young people make more money, as they age and make more money, get that first job, buy a house, get married, we actually find them becoming a lot more fiscally conservative. So once you make about $40,000 to $50,000 a year, once you're in that group, majorities of millennials oppose income redistribution, oppose increasing spending on financial assistance to the poor, and support for a lot of government guarantees plummet. And what that tells us is that as young people start paying more taxes, they become a bit more interested about the effectiveness of where their tax dollars are going. And that's exactly what we would expect. And as a result, once this starts to happen for young people, as they become get into their 30s and 40s, we may likely see some shakeup politically, but it's not exactly clear where they're going to go. And the reason why is that they are they are the most socially tolerant generation that we've had, and research suggests that that's not going to recede. Young people are not going to become less tolerant as they get older. If anything, they'll probably become more so.
So even when people are growing up and getting a little bit more fiscally centrist or conservative, their views on things like drug decriminalization and other sort of paternalistic state policies aren't changing?
To a large degree, when it comes to issues of tolerance, they remain socially liberal or maybe become a bit more liberal over time. So, for instance, gay marriage is a good example of this. If you'll notice in the data, young people aren't the only ones that are becoming more supportive of gay marriage. Now, in the past, the big social issue was interracial dating and interracial marriage. People who were more liberal on those issues back then, it's not like they became more conservative on that as they aged. If anything, they became more supportive, and now it's not even really an issue. No one thinks that's a big deal. Now, when it comes to things like police involvement and drugs like cocaine and heroin, I don't know what we can expect. But what we can see is this generation cares a lot about individual autonomy. And in the absence of a lot of evidence suggesting that the state has to intervene or else people are going to get hurt, they tend to favor freedom over control. And a great example of this actually is Bitcoin. This is a great example. So Bitcoin is an online digital currency. It's not controlled by any particular government. The Federal Reserve doesn't have any say in it. The supply is determined by a mathematical algorithm. And a lot of people don't know what it is. But when you tell them, you want to see what's their first reaction. So we did this on one of our surveys. We asked people if they'd heard of Bitcoin, and then we asked them, after telling them what it was, if they thought it should be allowed or banned. And older people wanted to ban it. Younger people wanted to allow it. And that's even among the young people who didn't know what it was. That tells you something.
That's amazing.
When you don't know what something is, what's your gut reaction? Is your gut reaction to allow or to control? And young people are much more likely to say allow. And that's something that's probably not going to change a whole lot as they get older.
That's so interesting. So it seems really like there's some pretty big changes happening really fast, really quickly in the realm of political opinion among young Americans. And Matthew, as a millennial, have you personally witnessed or experienced any shifts in political opinion of your peers or political opinions that you've held since you became aware of politics at all?
So I can't say that I've witnessed any shifts because I think I'm in the shift. I think that I'm kind of riding the shift, riding that wave out, and so it's a lot harder for me to kind of look around and notice that things are changing because I kind of see this as normal. But the really interesting thing is when you talk to older people, or I shouldn't say older people, older millennials, people who were involved in Students for Liberty maybe 6 or 7 years ago, and say things like, wow, like we had no idea it could ever get this big. Alexander McCoben, who is a co-founder and president of SFL, often tells a story a lot where he thought he was literally the only libertarian student in the whole entire country. And nowadays, if you're a libertarian student, you have like 500 friends on Facebook who are all libertarians and have profile pictures with Ron Paul, and you go to all these conferences and you hang out and you Snapchat everybody, and there's this entire huge libertarian youth community out there. And so I have to say that is evidence that things are changing and that we are witnessing shifts in kind of what I like to call almost cultural libertarianism, where there is a community out there. And I think that a major reason for this whole entire change, which we haven't touched on yet, and I'm surprised, is the internet. This is the generation that has lived through the internet revolution, the internet age, and it's changing everything. We want to talk about Bitcoin, that's a product of the internet. And so I think that we've seen this youthful, exuberant, libertarian community come about because of the internet. And I think that it's doing so much for our world, for our movement, and it's only going to continue to do amazing things that we can't even ever dream of. Just like students 10 years ago who would sit in their dorm rooms and read Hayek would never in a million years think that they could then, in 10 years be listening to a reasoned pollster and a student from New York talking about how the libertarian movement is expanding. There's just amazing things going on, and I think a lot of it has to do with the internet.
Absolutely. And it's not only the internet is not only shaking up political opinion in America among young people, but I've read a number of articles linking the internet and easier communication technologies in the decline of things like cars and driving. And it's a little off topic, and I don't mean to jump away from the poll too quickly, but so there are so many things that are happening that are changing within the millennial generation, and it seems like the millennial generation is not only politically unclaimed, but perhaps unclaimed by these major markets and major sort of rites of passage to adulthood, and these things that have sort of been that sort of defined youth culture in the past, and becoming an adult, like getting married, buying a house, buying cars, even getting driver's licenses. What do you think about that? Like, do you think that the change is going to expand beyond the political sphere and really shake up everything?
Well, I think maybe Matthew should be answering this question, but I think the answer is yes. Technology is really what's behind these changes. I don't think it's just a good speaker that inspires people that makes all the change. It can be a catalyst, but a lot of these trends are long-term tectonic shifts. And technology is what often drives these shifts, and economic prosperity that results from that technology. And often, actually, what that brings about is social tolerance seems to be a byproduct of technological progress and economic prosperity, but that's kind of a byproduct of these other major things that are changing.
Yeah, I think that every generation looks to rebuild society and culture in its own way, right? Every generation, whether we say Generation X, Y, the baby boomers, the millennials, whatever, have their impact on our world. Because young people often kind of drive, the new changes and the new culture that's brought about in more mainstream society. And so I think obviously millennials are going to radically try to change things. And I don't know if I'm the perfect person to speak to this, and I know that we're a little off topic, but I think we have to assume that major changes are going on. Let's just take life expectancy and look at that. If young people, because of this incredible rise in technology and the amazing things that are going on, can live 20, 30 years longer than our parents and grandparents, you're looking at a very different life, whether we are going to assume the same job for an extended period of time, whether we're going to wait to get married, or we're going to have multiple marriages, or we're going to change the idea of marriage. I think there's a lot of things that this generation can do and is starting to push through that we're never really going to see the end of for a very long time. We kind of can sit here and speculate and throw things at the wall and see what sticks. But I think it's a really interesting time to be alive for many different reasons. And I like to think of, in 100 years, what are textbooks going to say about the millennial generation, and what are people going to say about 2014 and what was going on with the ALS ice bucket challenge and all this stuff that's happening around the world. And so I'm not going to speculate on what's going to happen, but I think that we can say, because that we've been influenced by the internet, by this idea that if we want, I could just start a blog tomorrow, and then by next week I could be influencing millions of people around the world, putting up whatever's on my blog. And you said communication channels are breaking down. There's just so much creative destruction. This just age of the internet is changing everything around us, and none of us know what's going to happen. But I'm excited to see, and I'm excited to live through that.
It really, I feel energized constantly by seeing the ways that technology facilitates change in the world, because it seems like it's not only surprising to me as a millennial, but to many of the older folks that I talk to, just the idea that something like sharing a video on Facebook can actually change something. And you touched on that when you were talking about your experience protesting the record label of Lupe Fiasco earlier, and that's a really incredible story, and that's very energizing to hear about, Matthew.
Yeah, that's exactly like the type of stuff that I'm talking about. One day I was on a message board on some internet website, and we got a bunch of people together, and then the next day some kid who knew how to make a website made a website, and then we put it on Facebook, and within a week we had 1,000 people RSVPing to come to New York for a protest. And it was like, what did we just do? And imagine how much time and effort that would have taken 30 years ago. And we just were able to put something together in a week, and then within a month, an international corporation that just puts out billions of dollars a year was like, yeah, we have to put this record out because the fans are mad at us. I mean, things like that are just what? It's unbelievable, and it's all the product of this new culture that we've created because of the internet.
It's just mind-blowing constantly to me. So it seems like and I find myself just sort of heavily sighing at a lot of the articles that I read. They're like, oh, millennials are like this, millennials are the lazy generation, millennials are the selfie generation, the most or not individualistic, but the most self-centered generation. And I read a report on marketing from, oh gosh, I cannot remember the publication that it was in. It's CBE Marketing Group, perhaps. And this report researched values important to millennials and values important to boomers. And I was really kind of shocked by the results that they found. So in this report, from this poll, baby boomers stated that their most important values in life were justice, family, integrity, practicality, and duty, whereas millennials stated that their most important values were happiness, passion, diversity, sharing, and discovery. And I honestly felt like I was reading one of the slogans from 1984 or something when I read the values of baby boomers. And now that we're the largest generation in America, most decisions in politics and business are still made by older people. Is it possible that all of this confusion over whether millennials actually believe in anything, or aren't they just confused? Do you think this is all sort of based upon our fundamentally different set of values surrounding what matters in life?
Yeah, I think that is fascinating. I haven't heard of this until you brought it up, but what happiness, passion, diversity, sharing, and discovery, that's awesome. I wonder how much of this has to do with the fact that millennials are young and that we have more of a propensity to go out on a Friday night and stay out till 4 a.m. compared to our older, or the boomers, who are looking at things like justice, family, integrity, practicality, and duty. But I think this just gets back to everything that we've talked about tonight, and that things are changing. And there is this confusion, and there's this real popularity out there that really aggravates me, where it's so fun and popular for older people to talk down about millennials, right? If you criticize a millennial, it's cool, oh, they only take selfies and they worship President Obama and all this ridiculous nonsense. And I think older people, and I think the boomers, should recognize the fact that we are an awesome generation. We're doing great things out there in the world, and that we shouldn't just be looked down upon. That every generation, like I said earlier, looks to kind of rebuild culture and society the way that they see fit. And so if boomers just want to, yell at us all the time and say all these ridiculous things, they can do that, but they're not really getting in our way, right? We're going to do what we're going to do. If we're going to become like an anti-political generation or a generation that no political party can really like corral, or we're going to, change the way marriage works or whatever we're going to do, I think that we're going to do our thing. And if anything, we're a very empowered generation because we see that you can just make an app on your phone and then drop out of school and be like a millionaire by next Tuesday. So I think there's just really cool things going on in the world, and I can just say this a million times. And I know that there's some polling out there that say that millennials are not as much as self-starters as older groups. I know that there's a lot of other polling out there that I have not gotten into. Emily, maybe you can shed light on some of this other more cultural stuff. But just from my perspective, I don't know, maybe I'm a little biased, but I think we're pretty awesome.
Well, I would agree, Matthew. I think there is a tendency for every older generation to look at the young ones and see all their faults. But I also think that there's something that they're concerned about, and that is that I actually think this is true of a lot of generations, that when they were younger, everyone gets a trophy, right? If you heard about this, the participation trophy generation. And a lot of older people care a lot about bootstrapping. And you don't get what you need, you get what you earn. You get what you produce, not what you feel like you deserve. And they're concerned that young people may not know that, because once you get out into the real world, unfortunately, not everyone gets a participation trophy. Everyone has to work hard. And it's not a perfect meritocracy, obviously, but as it turns out, the people who work harder are more likely to be successful than those who don't. And I think that they're concerned. They're concerned that their kids, that the younger generation may not know that. However, I can say, looking at data, that they might not have to worry so much. Young people actually do believe in meritocracy. They do believe that fairness is getting what you earn rather than what you need. And it might actually be that all those participation trophies annoyed the hell out of them. And they thought, no, I want to get what I am able to achieve on my own merits. And so a lot of this has to just do with time. Younger people haven't yet taken on those additional responsibilities like buying a house, having kids, getting married, perhaps in a different order than that, actually, but those kinds of things will change priorities. And when that happens, I suspect we'll find that millennials are a lot like generations before them when it comes to responsibility. But like Matthew was saying, millennials are optimistic about their ability to change the future, to make it a better place. And I think the combination of those two are very powerful and lead us to have an optimistic view of the future.
And on that fabulously uplifting note, one last question before I turn it over to audience questions, if they have any. What do you think are going to be the defining characteristics? If you could look into the future and you could see, all of the research published about all sorts of trends within the millennial generation, what do you think are going to be, from your perspective now, the defining characteristics of our generation from the knowledge that you currently have? Emily, I would love for you to take this question.
The defining characteristics. I think I've already covered this, to be honest, which is that they are going to be the most socially tolerant generation that we've seen, and prioritizing individual autonomy over control whenever possible. I think that's what's going to make them stand out. They actually are not that different when it comes to economic issues, and that's actually a great thing. Given the Great Recession, we might have expected people to have soured a lot on the free market system, the system that brings prosperity, income, mobility, but it turns out that they haven't soured on it. And so I think the defining characteristic will be increasing social tolerance coupled with an appreciation for hard work and the free market system. And I think there's reason to be optimistic.
Fabulous. Matthew, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'll throw something out here. So I don't know what the defining characteristics. I will defer to Emily on that. But I'll throw something that I've been thinking about, and that is the opportunity for this generation for the millennials, really to alter politics as we see it. So we went through a lot of the numbers of the polling today, but there's also been talk about libertarians consistently in the more conservative or Republican right center coalition, and it seems like things could be changing just in politics generally. We see libertarians and Democrats getting along on a lot of other issues when it comes to things like NSA surveillance, immigration policy, same-sex marriage, things like that. And yet we see libertarians, very much in agreement with Republicans on issues like tax reform, regulation, promoting entrepreneurship, things like that. And if libertarianism, especially kind of this young millennial libertarianism, really is able to take root, if the findings that we have in this Reason Root poll, if we can extend them out, and if this really is the libertarian generation that we like to think of it as it is, what is the impact of that, and then what does American politics look like in 30 years if libertarians, not even as a party, but just as libertarians in each of the Republican and Democratic parties, are really able to have a stronghold and able to influence and push those parties in different ways? What does the American political structure look like? And do we have kind of a different political realignment? And what happens with all of that? So these are questions that no one's going to have answers for a very long time, but things that I like to think about. Could millennials really be, a defining change in American politics and another realignment? Something that I think we should look at, and maybe we can strive towards as we all age and get older and get some gray hair.
Absolutely. So audience, if y'all have any questions for Emily or Matthew on the poll, on the striking libertarian trends of the millennial generation, submit them now. I've got a question. Chance Davies from Grand Prairie Regional College asks the question, what can be said for the labeling of us millennials as Generation Debt?
It's accurate. Well, it depends on what you mean by debt. If they mean personal debt, or do they mean they're inheriting massive public debt? When it comes to public debt, then the answer is yes. I think a lot of young people are aware that Social Security, for instance, isn't going to be necessarily there for them in the same way it has been for older generations, but that hasn't really sunk in what that means. And I don't think that they're fully aware that we're going to have to raise taxes on them to pay for older generations, and that they won't actually get that money back.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. I don't have the poll in front of me right now, but there was a poll recently that came out about Social Security that I wrote an op-ed for, that I think found that only 8% of millennials think that they're going to get full Social Security benefits without having any taxes raised. 8%, which was pretty unbelievable. But that also highlights another part of the poll that I wanted to get into, that 54% of the Reason Root poll responders say that they want the government to guarantee a college education for anyone who wants one. And when I think generation debt, sure, the national debt and the deficit, contributes to that. But when I think personal debt, you have to immediately jump right into college debt. And a great way to think about the impact of college debt is if someone went to any 16 or 17-year-old in this country and was like, hey, there's a $150,000 property that I want you to invest in. It's going to be an awesome investment. You totally should do it. No one would ever agree to that. But we say, oh, but it's for your future, and it's gonna pan out, and your return is gonna be amazing. And it's just not for most people. For most people, it's a $150,000 apartment somewhere that is a terrible investment for a 16-year-old. And so I think that, yeah, I guess we are generation debt for two ways, for just like nationally, and that if this college debt machine bubble keeps going, a lot of students out there, and I think this is just horrible. A lot of students out there have no idea what they're embarking on with their college investment, and we're just pumping out students that are just going to have thousands and thousands of dollars of debt that they're never going to be able to escape from, and that's just really sad. And so I think the label generation debt, to me, like, that keeps me up at night. That's terrible that we're doing this to so many young people, and it's something that I wish the government would stop subsidizing.
Absolutely. I honestly, I'm one of very few people that I know at my university, even though it is, I go to a very affordable school, especially for in-state and even out-of-state students. I'm still one of the few people I know that has not taken out any student loans by the good grace of my grandfather's fiscal responsibility in teaching his children. And it's just absolutely insane. And Chance, our question asker, says, "Thank you very much." And that answers his question perfectly. Thank you so much, Emily and Matthew, for coming tonight. I thought it was a lot of fun. I hope you enjoyed yourselves too.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
It looks like we don't have any other questions from the audience. And thank you guys so much again for coming tonight. Audience members, make sure to look out for the recording of this podcast. We'll post it all over the Facebook page, which you can follow at facebook.com/SFL on air. And look for those recordings on iTunes and Amazon. Matthew, Emily, it was fabulous having you tonight. Thank you so much for coming. Well, guys, have a great night, and I will see you in a couple weeks. Bye-bye. If you like what you heard, visit studentsforliberty.org/SFL-on-air or visit us on Facebook at facebook.com/SFL-on-air. Special thanks to Sarah Thayer, Ankur Chawla, Corey Massimino, and the rest of the Educational Programs team.